Hello and welcome. You are officially off the Deaton path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of November 7th, 2024. We are recording this week from the Freedom Seekers Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is historian and good friend Paul Presley. Paul holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton University, a Master of Public Administration from Harvard, and a PhD from Oxford University. He is the former director of the Ossabaw Island Education Alliance, which is a partnership between the Georgia Board of Regents, the Department of Natural Resources, and the Ossabaw Island Foundation. He served in that role from 2005 to 2017. In that role, Paul organized a very important symposium in 2008 on African American life on the Georgia coast. This led directly to a book of the papers presented there, edited by renowned historian of slavery Philip Morgan, entitled African American Life in the Georgia Lowcountry, the Gullah Geechee and the Atlantic World, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2010. Before his work with Ossabaw Island, Paul served for 23 years as the headmaster and principal of the Savannah Country Day School. Paul's other books include On the Rim of the Caribbean, Colonial Georgia and the British Atlantic World, 1750 to 1775, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2013, which won the Georgia Historical Society's Malcolm Bell Jr. and Muriel Barrow Bell Award for the best book in Georgia history. He co-edited a book with Paul Sutter entitled Coastal Nature, Coastal Culture, Environmental Histories of the Georgia Coast, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2018, and which he joined me on this podcast to talk about on January 14th, 2019. And his latest book, and the one he's here to talk about with me today, entitled A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country, published by the University of Georgia Press on August 1st of this year. It is a powerful and important new interpretation of Black life in the early American Republic, deeply researched and well-written. On a personal note, Paul Presley is one of the first people I met when I came to Savannah in 1998, and he has been not only a good friend to me over the years, but a strong supporter of the Georgia Historical Society and a role model of what a public intellectual should be. I'm delighted to have him here on this podcast. My conversation with Paul Presley begins now. Paul Presley, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited about this.
I think that you are the first repeat visitor on Off the Deaton Path. You and I got together several years ago before the pandemic and talked about your last book, which you edited. But this is another book that you are the sole author of, published by the University of Georgia Press. It's called A Southern Underground Railroad. And the first thing I want you to tell our listening audience is what is the Southern Underground Railroad?
But this is exciting. First of all, it is great to be a pioneer, the first person to do a second interview. But nevertheless, a Southern Underground Railroad. I started studying a handful of people who escaped, some from Ossabaw Island, others from other islands and from the coast, and they headed to Spanish Florida. And this is I began seeing people leaving and escaping over a 40-year period, from the end of the Revolution, call it 1784, to 1818, to the First Seminole War. And during that period of time, I found that several hundred people. And then by the time you get up to the 1810, 1812, 1813, 1815, it's several thousand people escape from the coast of Georgia, headed to Spanish Florida, the Seminoles, and the creek towns that were in the lower part of the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers. That's different. It's different from the word Southern Underground is a little bit, put quotes around it and throw it out if you want to, if that makes anyone uncomfortable. There are no safe houses. There are no abolitionists. There are no Quakers. There's nobody helping them to escape. This is done by a small group of people at a time who own their own, manage to find their way 100 miles and find a new life in a different culture, different language, different traditions, very different from what happened when we're talking about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and fleeing north.
Mm-hmm.
You're speaking the same language and you have an audience, a ready-made audience. So may not be a Southern Underground Railroad in that sense, but I think that these people, and I estimate between 3,000 to 5,000, what I like to say, passed the arc of liberty from the generation of the Revolution to the generation of the Underground Railroad that we know.
Mm-hmm. Let's back up a moment. How did you get interested in this topic?
It's been a long process. And the 4 books that I have been part of, 2 of which I've written, 1 of which I co-edited, and the 4th of which I produced, have primarily been about African Americans. And this started in 2005 when I became director of the Ossabaw Island Education Alliance. And I was on this island, and Ossabaw is an incredible place. And I think, as you know, Stan, today it's 26,000 acres. It's a national treasure. Only one person lives on the island.
And situate it for our readers, if you will, where it is and
okay.
all of that.
Absolutely.
It's our readers, our listeners. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
It's 15 miles south of Savannah. But in fact, you go out to Tabby, go down to Wausau, and then you almost could swim, but don't try it because the currents are treacherous. Swim over to Ossabaw. And it's 26,000 acres. Only one person is on it, not connected to the land, not connected to the mainland. And beautiful. As one poet said, it's like being present at the creation when you see the sunrise on the beach. But the reality is, it was in the late 18th century, there were 3 indigo plantations, 4 Sea Island cotton plantations, and it was fully developed. Timber was being cut for mast for sailing ships. And there were herds of cattle, and it was sort of the grocery store of Savannah. So from there, I began to pick up traces of these people that were doing it. And I said, okay, I had one man named Titus who led 28 people to Spanish Florida over a 12-year career. And he crossed the international boundary, which is the St. Mary's River, several times. He created 3 different communities, maroon communities, where you're in the woods, in the swamps, isolated. 1 in Florida and 2 in Georgia. How could this be? You don't hear about this. And part of this is that it says something about the way American history is taught. We think of westward expansion. You're looking west. People do not look south. They're not looking beyond the borders of the United States. And that's what has to happen. This is as much Caribbean history as it is U.S. history.
So did you get interested in this because you were working for Ossabaw Island, or did you already know something about this? Because as you said, your work has, a lot of it has focused on African-American history. Is this something that you've had a lifelong interest in? Is this a recent, and by that I mean the last 20 years, really, since you're stepped away from being a full-time educator? How did you land on this subject and this topic?
Well, when I was nearing retirement as head of school here in Savannah Country Day School, I published 2 articles in the Georgia Historical Quarterly. An historian at the University of Georgia, John Ensko, gave me great help and kept encouraging me. And it was rather amateurish, those first couple of efforts. And then I was asked, when I retired from Savannah Country Day in 2004, I was asked to join the board of the Ossabaw Island Foundation because they needed an educator. Well, I said, well, that makes sense. Well, what am I supposed to do? And I joined the board. And after I joined, they kicked me off, made me director of the Education Alliance. It turns out that they were asking me to tell the story basically of African Americans from the 1760s coming onto the island to the 1980s, when these 3 tabby cabins that remain from those original plantations. It's a beautiful story. There's a lot of layers to it. But I realized I don't like to be isolated. I like to put a story into the larger context. And that's why we got the coast of Georgia. And that's why we got to Spanish Florida.
And I'm going to back up for a minute completely out of this book and ask you about your background. You have a PhD in history from Oxford University in the UK. Did you ever consider going into mainstream academia and being a history professor? Because you certainly made up for lost time in the last 20 years. As you mentioned, you've been involved in the production of 4 books. So, I mean, you've got tenure now, I think. But why did you choose the path that you did?
It's sort of interesting. I tell myself, right now I'm the equivalent of a 33-year-old. And I may be candidate for an assistant professorship.
I think
But
you'd be a full professor by now, but go ahead.
I did my PhD on French history. It was the history of the teachers coming out of the Revolution, forming the Napoleonic University, which is the public education in France, and what kind of traditions they brought across the Revolution. And it really wasn't going anywhere. It was a nice thesis, and I went to Harvard University and got a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government. And then I did something that completely flummoxed everybody, and I joined an investment bank, Kidder Peabody in New York, and spent 2 years in Beirut, Lebanon. And Beirut was beginning to heat up. The Palestinians had been expelled from Jordan. And when I first landed and rode in from Beirut, I was stopped by a Palestinian liberation fighter and asked to see my passport, sitting there with a machine gun over his shoulders. That got my attention. But I started teaching part-time at the American University of Beirut, and I had a great deal of fun, but I was about 30 years old at that point. And I think academia was out of reach. So when the smoke cleared, I said, okay, what do I do? And I said, I want to do what other members of my family have done, and that's teach at the high school level. And the apple doesn't fall from the tree. So I ended up teaching eighth graders American history in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I like to say that's been the best year of my life. I enjoyed that so much.
And tell me, just for the benefit of our listeners who I know who are in the Atlanta area, your father had something to do, I think. I don't want to mess this story up, so I'll let you tell it. But you, in following their footsteps, tell us a little bit about what your father, maybe even your grandfather, did.
Well, my father was the founding president of the Westminster Schools in Atlanta,
Right.
which is sort of the premier school and maybe in the Southeast. And he really built that. I think he was president of it for 23 years. He came from the Macaulay School, where he was co-headmaster, and he married the boss's daughter. And so my grandfather founded Macaulay School in 1905. And I have a great-great-grandfather who was the founding president of Erskine College in South Carolina. Anyways, it's a tradition of education.
It sure is. Wow. And what was your father's name, Paul?
William L. Presley.
Well, so you, for many years, I know were a headmaster here. And so you published your first book with UGA Press and about Savannah Caribbean connections. This was a wholly different subject. And I have to tell you, one of the things that most impressed me is you immerse yourself into a literature that is daunting. There's been a lot written about Native American history in the Southeast, Native American Southeastern history over the last 25 to 30 years. And you seem to have read all of it. You have immersed yourself in it. You have also become familiar with African American history. It's quite impressive. Was it daunting to you to get into this field? It has a language all of its own, a lingo all of its own, and you seem to have mastered all of it.
Well, thank you for that. You're being kind and way too kind. The truth of the matter is, I haven't mastered it, and I really don't know a great deal about it. And I started small. I took small steps, and I think I did best on the chapter on Black Seminoles. But there's so little available. The whole thing about this project is what historians call archival silence.
Mm-hmm.
That's a term that has got respectability among historians because a lot of us are working on subjects that involve archival silence. And what's the role of historical imagination? You can put together a timeline, but at some point you got to figure out what are hopes and aspirations and dreams. And when you come to the Black Seminoles, that's a bit of a reach. And I tried to stay within a mainline interpretation on most of what I wrote about Native Americans, indigenous people.
So to be clear for our listeners, what you're writing about here are a number of African Americans who fled from coastal Georgia in the years after the American Revolution, looking for freedom.
Yes.
And we don't call them runaways anymore. You call them freedom seekers, which is where historians are now. And they sought it in some level, on some level, in some measure, across the border, as you say, into Spanish Florida. And even when it became, even when it was British Florida, many of them were going there to find their freedom. And to be clear, these people that you're writing about, if you think about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as having left thousands of pages of documentary evidence of their lives, these people that you've written about and that you've researched left virtually nothing behind. So I'm going to start with that big picture. How did you get into the lives of, and I'm just running off some names here, these people who you have brought to life: Muhammad, Hercules, and Betty, and Titus? How did you find out so much about them?
Let me start with Titus. And Titus was born about 1767. How do you know that? I gave a talk in Macon and somebody said, how do you know he was born in 1767? Well, good question. But there were two notices posted about 1788 when he escaped, giving his age. And they're giving two different ages in two different notices. So roughly 1767. I found a deed book in the Georgia Historical Society, and it lists the inventory of the Morel plantations on Ossabaw Island. So I know that Titus's father and mother were Tom and Nellie. And I found a not just that deed book, but another deed book, which shows the purchase of John Morel and his decision not to purchase enslaved people from Africa or from the Caribbean. He purchased the entire estate, 59 people, from a deerskin merchant who passed away in Augusta. And that man's nephew had come over from Ireland and moved them down, that 59 people, to Savannah to create a rice plantation. And of course, this man from Dublin made a hash of it and gave up, went back to Dublin, and sold it to John Morel. Morel was wise. Instead of buying individuals, primarily black males who didn't last long, he bought entire families. And Tom and Nellie had 7 children, and Bacchus was one of those children. And so they're raised in pretty much autonomous conditions on Ossabaw. So, okay, so I can guess that Titus spoke relatively good English, that he had the security of a large family, and that he was familiar with white ways. And we know that that's reinforced when John Morel made him his waiting man when he was 18 years old. And then you sort of take it from there. But the real gold mine was the Spanish archives. In 1821, Spain gave up. Remember, Spain was in Florida from 1565 to 1821, with the exception of those 20 years of British history, 1763 to 1783. They left every document that was present in that year to Thomas Jefferson and the U.S. government. I shouldn't say Thomas Jefferson, to the U.S. government. 65,000 pages of documents. Those are in the Library of Congress, and it's just incredible that they have survived. So I did find some documentation on Titus. He was considered an outlaw, the most dangerous person in North Florida.
So the entire Spanish archive from those years you mentioned, they're not in Seville, they're not in Spain, they're in Washington, D.C.
And they turned over the entire thing. Why the Americans did not, the local officials among the Americans, why they didn't burn them right there on the spot, something of a mystery. Because there were a lot, and they shipped them up to Washington, and Washington preserved them. They were in the basement of the Library of Congress for years and years, and only in the 1960s were they sort of gradually brought out. And in 2021, every one of them was put online. And it was sort of like the gold rush.
And as a historian, are they difficult to read? Are they deciphering 18th century written English is difficult for me sometimes. I assume these were written in Spanish.
Baroque Spanish. Baroque Spanish. Fortunately, the person I was most interested in was Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Howard, let's call him Charles Howard, who was an Irishman. So when he wrote in Spanish, he was really writing in English. I mean, the grammatical structure. It's not great Spanish. and it greatly facilitated. I came across many documents that I could not read, and I gave them to a teacher, professor, Dr. Anna Torres at Armstrong, and she translated them, and they were worth their weight in gold.
Wow. So you did not have to travel to Spain to see these archives.
No, I had to travel to Gainesville to read them on microfilm.
Right. So you went to Florida. Okay. Yeah. I know that you worked in the Smathers Library there.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about your research in a minute. I want you to continue to tell the stories of these remarkable people whose lives you have uncovered and have in many ways used, as you said. It's hard to know reading this sometimes where historical imagination is and where the archival silence and the archival evidence is. But you begin this whole book, I think, by telling, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the story of Hercules and Betty and their escape from Ossabaw. Tell that remarkable story.
Yeah, it was a fascinating thing. Hercules, Betty was one of the daughter of one of the families from Augusta. And Hercules came from Angola. That we know from notices in the Georgia Gazette. Hercules, in the first 3 years of the American Revolution, they were kept on Ossabaw Island. Nothing happened. They were patriot. I mean, their masters were patriots. But when the British took control of Savannah, Hercules and 29 other people were brought by Mrs. Morrell. Her husband had died. John Morrell had died. Was brought over to Savannah to help build the fortifications against the French, Count d'Estaing, and the Americans, General Benjamin Lincoln. And we don't know exactly what Hercules did, but I can just imagine, and this is where historical imagination, he landed at the wharf in Savannah, and it was crowded with cargo, with ammunition. It was crowded with people, soldiers, with food supplies, and he'd never seen such a thing. He had been moving a boat in and out of Savannah before that, so he kind of knew the scope. It apparently, and I'm making a jump here, he fought with Colonel Thomas Brown on the right flank of the British. So Hercules gets back on Ossabaw Island with Betty and their two children, Prince and Winter. And he says, okay, we've got to figure out a way to get out of here. I'm not going to get my freedom in Savannah. So he's commissioned to build a yawl. Now, a yawl is a small vessel. It's like 20 feet long, and it's used in a port to carry goods from a ship to the shore or from ship to ship. It's not meant for travel. Hercules said, you know what? We need another family to join us. Now, this is interesting. Two families got together, and it was Jack and Oba. Jack, we know, was also from Angola. So it's 9 people get in a yawl that just had the pitch on it. It still was not complete. It had a little tiny sail, and it had 2 oars in it. That 9 people made it all the way to St. Augustine.
Wow.
I guess they went behind the Berry Islands. That we know. Now, here's the thing I think is so interesting about it, and why I love trying to figure out the meaning of this whole migration that took place, because there were choices that African Americans had to make once they crossed the border. And Hercules goes immediately to Colonel Thomas Brown, whom he had fought under during the siege of Savannah with his wife, and he serves under him. But Jack and Oba and their children and one other person go towards the indigenous people, the Seminoles, where they become Black Seminoles, presumably. And there's a whole other story. What is a Black Seminole? So you had those choices to make. And that's why I really love trying through whether it's the revolution or afterwards, what kind of choices did they make and why did they make them?
And it also begs the question as you read about this, and whether it's the British period that ends in 1783, as you noted, or the Second Spanish period, what kind of reception did they receive when they got there? Were they treated any differently? Did the British and the Spanish view African Americans in a different way than the Americans did?
The British viewed them with pretty much with contempt. But they're in the middle of a war. They needed help, and these people were workers. So they employed, like Hercules and Betty, they employed them and were quite happy. I mean, slavery was never part of their DNA. The Spanish were very different. Spanish law recognized Black people, enslaved people, as legal personalities. An enslaved person could sue in a Spanish court against his or her enslaver, particularly if it was mistreatment. Didn't happen often, but it could, and sometimes the decision was in their favor. They restored their humanity to them. And and of course, you have a three-caste society in Spain. You have, I mean, in Spain, in Spanish America, you've got white people at the top, Black people at the bottom, and then you have mixed race and free Blacks. And that was just a recognized part of it. And keep in mind that Spanish Florida was undermanned. I mean, they needed every single soul that could be there possibly. But now here's the choice. When an African American made it to Amelia Island, that person could go to St. Augustine and petition the Spanish governor for free status, for freedom, on condition that that person converted to Catholicism. And there was a substantial community of free Blacks in St. Augustine during this whole period, 40-year period. The Catholic Church reached out to them and helped them assimilate. They were craftsmen, they were carpenters, they were brick masons. They were fairly substantial people. But then you had a second group, and it was a larger group, that chose to remain in the countryside of northern Florida. And they did not convert to Catholicism. What they would do is they'd go to a farmer. Most of the people, white people, were farmers, and they would contract for their labor. And they would change from year to year, go from one farm to another. They were not popular. And there were complaints of, quote, a multitude of foreign Blacks, unquote, which sort of echoes a little bit of the debates we're having currently right now. And I had one person who supervised free Black people. And he says, they just aren't trustworthy. They just don't. They're hard to supervise. Well, of course, what he was doing probably is treating them the way he would treat slaves, and that just wasn't going to go with them. Then you had a third group that became Maroons. They just took advantage of the fact that Florida is underpopulated, and they went undercover to inaccessible, inhospitable places, and they were survivalists. And then finally, that fourth group chose the Seminoles. And I won't get into that.
Well, I want to ask you more in a minute about the Maroons and about some of these different people. But geographically, I want you to situate what Spanish Florida is. When we think of Florida now, we see the peninsula on the map of the United States, and we know there's Pensacola in the west, Jacksonville on the east, and then Miami all the way down south. Spanish Florida did not encompass all of that territory. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. I have to smile when you say that. Spanish Florida was the size of a postage stamp. You take St. Augustine, which was a military outpost. It never really evolved beyond being a military outpost. And it really encompassed all that land that was on the east side of the St. Johns River. If you crossed the St. Johns and went 10 miles further, you were into Seminole territory. It was primarily where they hunted deer, so you're not going to see a Seminole necessarily. But you had to be a little bit cautious about what you were doing. So it was a very thin area. The same applied to the British. They never went beyond where the Spanish had gone, the St. Johns River. And then you can apply the same thing to West Florida.
Yeah, and there was a Spanish outpost in West Florida, at Pensacola, I believe, but not a whole lot in between. Certainly right. not the kind of settlements that the British developed in colonial British America. One of the two words in your subtitle are Indian country, and you've mentioned them here and there. So situate the natives, the indigenous people, for us, both in what we now think of as northern Florida and in southeastern and southwestern Georgia. Who were these people? Who did they belong to? What would they have been called? And how do they fit into your story?
Well, I loved it when Jack and Oba in 1781 chose not to stay in St. Augustine, which would have been your natural thing, but to flee beyond the St. Johns River and go to the Seminoles. And why would they do that? Well, they They would be welcomed by the Seminoles. They would be placed in a little settlement next to the Seminole settlement. They might have been half a mile apart. And they were given their complete freedom to do whatever they wanted. They could own property. They could farm what they wanted. But at the end of the year, 12-month period, they had to give 10, 20% of their produce to the chieftain of the Seminoles who distributed it. And the chieftain might say, I need so-and-so to go with me to help broker because this person spoke English and the chief did not, or spoke very broken English. But gradually, as time elapsed, and then we go from the 1790s, 1800, all of a sudden the Seminoles fall out with the Spanish and begin to raid plantations. And black Seminoles appear alongside them as raiders. And then finally, by 1810, 1812, you find units of black Seminoles fighting white Georgians. So black Georgians fighting white Georgians. And they were much more disciplined because they were accustomed to fight the way that they knew that Englishmen fought.
One of the scholars you mentioned at the very beginning of this book that you said to whom you are most indebted is Jane Landers. Jane Landers and I knew her from the University of Florida, my years there. What role did she play in helping you along this path?
But I almost dedicated my book to Jane Landers. Jane Landers is she's a seminal figure. She's written two great books, Black Society in Spanish Florida and the Atlantic Creoles. And she's countless articles, maybe 30 articles. And she really created this subject because she started writing in the late 1980s. And this was a neglected subject, and she was doing a doctoral thesis. And she was the one that brought forward the story of Fort Mose, which, as you know, 1738, a Spanish governor had said, let's take the free blacks who fled Carolina, slavery in Carolina, and give them their own settlement north of St. Augustine. And this became Fort Mose, 2 miles north of St. Augustine. And it was the first town of free blacks in North America. And she did a marvelous job of developing some of those people. Francisco Menendez, the person who was in charge of it. And see, I got a little bit of that action. The first chapter that I wrote is about black sailors in Savannah during Oglethorpe's period. And there was a captain, Captain Caleb Davis, who was trading illegally with St. Augustine, South Carolina, and Savannah. And the interesting thing about it was South Carolina was happy because he brought hard currency. St. Augustine was happy because he brought goods and provisions of this. Menendez, the commander of this black settlement, was indebted to Caleb Davis. When the Spanish government proclaimed freedom in this village, Caleb's sailors who'd been in Savannah deserted and went to Fort Mose and were there when they fought Oglethorpe and massacred 75 Scottish people from Darien.
Mm.
I mean, it's an incredible story. But again, that is real circumstantial evidence that they're putting together.
Who was Muhammad? One of the people that you write about.
Muhammad is the journey of Muhammad. The interesting thing is there's a wonderful article by a historian who discovered how he was enslaved. And he was a Bambari way up, probably in the country of Mali. That's not the country of Mali today, but it's roughly encompasses Mali and even larger. And he was brought down to a settlement, and I forget the name of the settlement, and sold to this woman, Fenda Lawrence. And she was a signore. And this just, it blows your mind. But women had a certain status. She was elite. She had money. She was probably a mistress of an English sea captain. And she was now mixed up with, and I shouldn't say mixed up, but she had a relationship with an Irish sea captain. And he was trading with Charleston and then with Savannah. So she provided his ships with what they took over. And Muhammad came from her settlement. And he comes to Savannah. Ends up on John Graham's rice plantation, Mulberry Grove. We'll hear about Mulberry Grove often. And he's there for about a year and a half, and he escapes. And the funny thing about it, he doesn't do what you would think he would do. He doesn't go up the Savannah River to the maroon communities that existed. He goes up to Indian country, and he's there for about 3 years. He's captured and brought back, and I won't do the rest of his life, except at the end of his life, he's brought to Beaufort and sold to somebody who's on the South Carolina side of the Savannah River. And this is in 1785. And he leads about 12 people to this maroon community on Bear Creek Island, where eventually it was about 80 to 100 people. And it survived until the Georgia State Militia and the South Carolina State Militia and 20 Catawba Indians closed in on 1787. And Muhammad, and we know this, he was killed in the fight.
Mm. Mm.
Now, some historians tried to make this a story of enslaved people fighting to overturn slavery. And I think that I and at least one other feel that that's not the case. They were fighting for self-defense. They basically wanted to be left alone. Their mistake was to accept too many people, and they had to raid plantations for enough corn, enough rice to be able to feed people.
And now, how did you put this story of Muhammad together? How did you tease that out of the archives? Just as an example, this is one person of many that you wrote about, and you gave us some idea earlier, but how did you uncover this story?
This is a story where I had to rely heavily on notices in the Georgia Gazette. This is a story where I relied on my research on my first book in the National Archives in England at Kew. And there's a tremendous amount of paperwork, information on Mulberry Grove by John Graham. And he was one of these businessmen. He was absolutely Scotsman, absolutely humorless, wonderful business person, and absolutely shameless in the way he enslaved Africans. But back in England, he wanted to claim credit for Mulberry Grove and asked for an unconscionably large number. But he put down all the names and what they were worth. So it gave me a context for putting Muhammad into what was going on in that rice plantation and what was it like, and the number of people that were escaping and those that were recaptured and brought back.
So this was his loyalist claim?
This was his loyalist claim.
Okay.
And
Go ahead.
Put that up against what happened on Bear Creek Island in 1787. That is arguably the largest maroon community in the history of the United States for 100 years. It was not arguably, it was the only one where military tactics were used, because the heart of it, about 10 men were soldiers that fought for the British during the siege of Savannah. And it was the longest lasting one for 5 years. So there was a trial of Captain Lewis, who was caught and eventually hung. And Lewis told all, and there's testimony from some of the enslaved women that they captured. So you take that, and that's the richest set of documentation that exists. Then you take John Graham's Q papers. You take the notices that Graham put in the Gazette. For example, Graham says, and he has only half an ear. Well, you can figure that one out. Half an ear means that it was cut off. And who cut it off? It had to be John Graham or the overseer, because that was a typical punishment of taking somebody, and you had a post in the quarter, you nailed the ear to the post, and then you cut it off in front of everybody.
You mentioned all of the documents that belong to the Spanish government that are now preserved in the Library of Congress. But where else did you go to uncover all of the different stories that you weave together in this book? What were the primary places, and what did you find there?
Well, University of Michigan, that grand holdings that they have, I did not go to the University of Michigan. What I did was I used a researcher, and I'm ashamed of that. In my first book, I would never have done such a thing, and I had to pay her a good fortune. But she generated a huge amount of documents for me, and what came out was just one small thing, and it was a manual by an overseer of people who were brought up from Florida in 1784 when the Spanish were getting out. Florida was all of a sudden, when the Spanish came back, the English had to leave. And you had something like 10,000 enslaved people in Florida. And some of the British planters began selling their people just to get liquid so they could move to the next place in the British Empire. And this was a group that was brought up in around the Satilla River plantation. And it was appalling to see how the brutality of it. And of something like 45 people, 19 died in that first year. And he said, and the overseer wrote, and most of them were idiots.
Mm.
You know, it just, you don't know quite what to do with that. But that sort of research at University of Michigan, you have to do. This Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I went there, some extremely important documentation. Where else?
And in Michigan, you're talking about the Clements Library, I think.
The Clements Library.
Mm-hmm.
And of course,
yeah.
the Library of Congress.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Smathers Library at the University of Florida, which I know holds a great deal of
and of course, the
good stuff.
The University of Georgia Library has a tremendous collection of documentation on Native Americans,
mm-hmm.
on creeks, and particularly on the chapter on the creeks. It's wonderful. It's never really been exploited before, but there are a ton of letters from planters on the coast of Georgia who lost enslaved people in 1785, 86, 87, 88, 90, 91, 92 to Creeks who came and raided their plantations. And they were describing what happened. And in fact, of course, they were covering up a little bit because some of the enslaved people saw this as an opportunity for freedom. And you couldn't claim compensation for somebody that was making a bid for freedom. So you had to say that they were kidnapped. But it's very, very detailed. But some of them actually resisted and did not want to go with the Creeks. They did not want to leave their families. Very compelling.
Is it safe, Paul, to say that most of the sources that you looked at, in order to cover whether you're either looking at indigenous people or African Americans, you are having to look at sources that were produced by white European Americans, and you sort of had to look through that? Is that safe to say?
Absolutely. Your hands are tied on this, and not only that, the documentation on the Seminoles. There's virtually no letter, no document that has survived that hadn't been looked at by 10 different historians and interpreted. It's how you kind of put it together. And the basic thing that your starting point is to see what are the 2 or 3 dominant interpretations. And on the Seminoles, you've got one group of historians that think the Seminoles the Black Seminoles were so independent of the indigenous people that they were in effect maroons. Then you have another group that says, no, absolutely not. The Seminoles considered them as their slaves. And in fact, they did. And when they were expelled and moved to Oklahoma, the Black people were listed as slaves. Even though they were not quite, historians are very uncomfortable with how to describe that relationship. And so I tried to work within that framework. But
and do you have any written documentation from the Seminoles themselves who said, here's what we considered them?
The only documentation would be the letters that were powwows, negotiations with officials like James C. Grove, who was the federal agent stationed in St. Mary's.
Mm-hmm.
He negotiated with Creeks and the Seminoles, and he kept very detailed records of what they said and how they said it. And you could take that so far, but you have to be very careful.
You've mentioned the word maroon several times here, and I will tell our listeners you're not talking about the color. You're talking about maroon communities. Where did they get that name, and what were these things?
Well, maroons, you have to start with the Spanish word cimarron, and cimarron it's a word that meant wild and unsettled. It really referred to cattle that were lost in the woods, and and cimarrons were enslaved people, freedom seekers in Jamaica, for example, who fled to the mountains. The leeward maroons and the windward maroons, and they were able to establish their freedom. They fought with the British Army. There were treaties, and today you have statues to some of their leaders. There was a woman named Queen Nanny, and Queen Nanny has she defeated the British Army, or unit of the British Army, and she has her image on the national currency of Jamaica. But you said the same thing in Brazil and in Latin America. But but Americans reduced it to maroons. Now, in 1999, Mark Mullins, an excellent historian, wrote a book on slavery in the South, and he said the South did not have maroons. He says that there weren't enough people, that was too settled. It didn't happen. Well, since then, there have been several studies, including mine, which sort of contradict that and said, well, it depends on how you define that term. These are people that went and sought inaccessible, inhospitable places. They lived in exile. They lived in a state of continuous crisis. They were willing to fight. That's key. They were willing to fight in self-defense. And they always had a leader. And this has emerged as a whole new field. Dismal Swamp, the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina is probably the most fertile field right now. But the term maroons, historians are really shameless. And what does a shameless historian do? They take that term and apply it, for example, talking about people of the Underground Railroad that reach Cincinnati and live as free people, but just hide so that they're not, nobody can identify them, but they're in a town and they're calling them maroons. No, maroons did not want to be around white people.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be isolated. They believed in self-determination and their own autonomy.
What do you think? How does your research, how does this book change the way we view this period? When we think about the American Revolution now, when we think about Georgia history, how does what you've brought to light, which has been covered for so long, how does this change? How should this change what we know about this period, these people, that time and place?
Number one, I think it shows the strength of Black resistance in the post-revolutionary South. See, if you read most books today that are written, they talk lovingly of what happened in the American Revolution, a mass insurrection, enslaved people fleeing to the British. And then you have this period of silence. And then all of a sudden, Underground Railroad with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. But I'm saying that at least until 1818, the borders of Georgia were actually the borders of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And what you happen is I go back to what I said earlier, it's the passing of the torch of liberty. People didn't find freedom in Jefferson's empire of liberty. Second thing, it shows that you've got to look beyond the borders of the United States to understand what happens inside the United States. Because the people on the coast of Georgia, we talk about Gullah, Geechee, we talk about West African retentions, maintaining traditions, the Gullah language, the diet, religious practices, trickster stories, and things of that nature. But historians have said, well, that shows they're passive. No, they're not. What I'm trying to show is that they are the Gullah at this time, before the borders closed. We're very active and we're very aware of the political world and what lay beyond.
Yeah, you make it clear these people are not isolated on an island and don't know anything about what's happening. They are connected to a much, much wider world, which leads me to ask this question, Paul, beyond Ossiball, and I want to ask you a little bit more about that in just a second. But beyond Ossiball, are there physical places where you can still go, whether in Florida or in southern Georgia, western Florida, southwestern Georgia, and stand on the ground and feel this history around you, or has it all been reclaimed or paved over?
The St. Mary's River. You need to drive along the St. Mary's River. You need to. There are a couple of books that do a reasonably good job and talk about it. And if you go west on the St. Mary's, the road that parallels on the Georgia side, St. Mary's River, to a little place, and you'll see a marker called Traders Hill. And Traders Hill was a trading post for Creeks and Seminoles, run by traders. And there's just a lot. It's very deserted, but you can imagine what took place there. And there was a big raid by Creeks, by Black people. It was a huge incident. Thought it was the start of a war. You can go back and you can feel all of this.
Mm-hmm. You and I have been to Ossiball together many times, and you've spent countless hours there, uncovering all this history. Do you go there? Have you been there and stood there, and can you still feel the presence of these people there?
I can feel the presence of Titus. I can feel the presence of Hercules and Betty. I've spent so much time with them. And I stand there in the three tabby cabins that were built in the 1840s. But an archaeologist, Dan Elliott, said that it looks like that there were cabins that were there in the pre-revolutionary period, and that would be Titus. So I can feel that spirit. But what interests me is I have taken African Americans, I've given a tour to African Americans who've come, who kind of know a little bit of the history, and they stand inside that cabin, and when they say, "I feel the spirit," it's different. It is absolutely different. And they want to do the ceremony of ablations with water. And you can see what's going on inside their minds and body. It's just something different.
Of all the people that you wrote about, do you know where any of them are buried? At least among the not the white Europeans, perhaps the Spanish, but the African Americans, or even any of the indigenous people. Have you been able to trace them all the way to the end?
The interesting thing about it is there were 225 African Americans on Ossiball Island. We have no idea where they're buried.
I was going to ask you that.
They were there for 100 years. We've got some clues. We've had one story saying that the owners in the 1920s decided to plant a special area. We don't know what that area was, but they dug up some grave signs that stood there. Someday I think we will do it. But when we give tours and you say you have 15 people and 3 of them are African Americans, first thing they want to know is, where are the graves?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Spirits are very, very important.
We talked about Ossiball a little bit. You mentioned there is no bridge to Ossiball. If anyone is listening to this and thinks to themselves, I'd like to go out to Ossiball and experience this for myself, how do they do that? Can they do that?
Absolutely. The Ossiball Island Foundation is there to make it accessible. It offers about 10 or 12 trips a year. You need to go online and look up OssibalIsland.org. And it's a beautiful website. It's elaborately designed, and go through and you see what those times are. And if you have a group that you would like to go, then you can call up Elizabeth DuBose, the executive director, or Robin Gunn, the program coordinator, and sort of arrange for your own private tour. But there always has to be a guide with you.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take you to write this book? Research and write?
8 years.
And how did you write it? Literally, did you write it longhand? Did you write on a computer? Did you write in the morning, in the evening? How does Paul Presley work?
I have to write it on a computer. And the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was when I got my first computer and discovered the joys of cutting and pasting. I think we all go through that process. But
Absolutely.
I've had working in the morning is this thing. I like to start work about 8 or 8:30 and go. Afternoons are not so great. And evenings I will do a little bit of work. But I was putting in 5 or 6 hours a day with questions. You have to alternate that and do the reading that's necessary for it. And again, the fact the internet makes it so much more possible to acquire the hard to get articles. I felt like one arm was tied behind my back because I'm not in academia and didn't have access to some of what I would have liked to have had.
Mm-hmm. Is there another book in you?
There's one more article. So we will see. And it has to do, excuse me, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, with Ebo Landing and a study of the slave dealers who created what became Ebo Landing and put that in context.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to seeing that. Well, Paul, congratulations on the publication of your book. It's called A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country, published by the University of Georgia Press. Thank you for once again coming on the podcast to talk about your book, and best of luck with it and all the research and more writing that you have going forward.
Thank you, Stan. I just hope that Hurricane Helene doesn't wash me out this next week.
Absolutely, us or anybody else. Thank you, Paul. My thanks to Paul Presley for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at ugapress.org. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the GHS camel jumping team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The GHS Director of Accounts Payable is Bill Shredder. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. The GHS table saw operator is Les Digits. Our Director of Employee Loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our complaints coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. Our IRS liaison is Major Payne Diaz. And our gastroenterologist is Cameron Diaz. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The official Off the Beaten Path holiday decoration specialist is Aretha Holly. The GHS holiday wardrobe consultant, as always, is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges studies is Lee Iapoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff, and our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Be sure to follow and like and share, please. You can find out everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. And you can go to deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar Building Bridges podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.